Good evening. Thank you for coming. My name's Dean Godson, Director of Policy Exchange, and it's a pleasure to inaugurate this important series of events which we've labelled What Do We Want from the Next Prime Minister? Economy obviously preeminent, and an outstanding panel here to address the issue tonight. We'll be taking them in alphabetical order. They're going to speak each for 6 minutes apiece, and then we'll throw it open to the floor for discussion and questions. It's a particular pleasure to be able to welcome Alistair Darling, who's been such a good friend to this organisation through the years on issues ranging from economy, environment and the future of the Union. He's come from Scotland tonight. He's first on. Then we'll go to Nick Macpherson, former Permanent Secretary of the Treasury, then Nicky Morgan, Chairman of the Treasury Select Committee, and then Liz Truss as Chief Secretary of the Treasury. We all look forward very much to hearing what they have to say, what you have to say. Only house rule, as always, is no question too outrageous. You just have to state your name and organisation candidly in the first instance. Alistair, thank you for coming.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm glad that you're restricting the nature of the questions. I'm not used to that, but your name and organisation will be fine. Not that I'm in any position to do anything about it nowadays, but it'd be good to know where the criticism came from. We live in quite extraordinary times at the moment, not just in this country, but people looking in at our country frequently ask what the hell is going on. This is a country where we've had reasonable stability in government, really reasonable certainty as to where we're going and where we want to go, but at the present time, quite clearly, we don't. Now, in addressing the subject, what do we want from our leaders tonight, one of the difficulties is, of course, for the next couple of months or so, we won't actually know who the leader, the next Prime Minister, actually is. And, you know, I have to say my expectations from the next leader will be, to quite a large extent, conditioned by who it is that the Conservative Party actually pick, and that I would not want to raise my expectations too high, given the views of one or two of those candidates, which you might guess is not quite the same as mine. But obviously the first starting point, which we can't get away from, is what we do about Brexit. And I'll just make this point, as Dina said, you know, I live in Edinburgh. I spent 3 years of my life fighting the Scottish referendum, and the only thing I would say in passing is you can win referendums. You do actually have to try if you're going to win popular support. But the Scottish politics have been defined by identity politics for the last 45 years. That is now happening in England and to quite a substantial extent Wales as well. And it's going to be with us for the rest of my life, and my guess is the rest of your lives too. So we better get used to it. The politics has changed from 100 years ago. It was very much class-based to one where identity is one of the foremost things that is defining how people think. Therefore, it is important that when we have the new Prime Minister in place, that I hope we can have something of a reset so far as the thinking on Brexit is concerned. It would be much better, in my view, if in 2016 Theresa May had said to the country, look, we are split down the middle, we're totally divided, and we're going to end up compromising one way or another. And equally saying to the European Union, you've got your problems as well, freedom of movement of people and so on. You know, this is an opportunity to perhaps think about how you do things, how you organise things. And I say that because conditioning the terms of debate is absolutely critical if you're going to make any political progress. That did not happen, and we've got a population today that is more polarised than it was 3 years ago, and my guess is that unless something radical changes, it's going to be more polarised still as we look over the next 5 to 10 years. And remember this, that even if we get a leaving deal this autumn, though I remain doubtful about that because I don't think the parliamentary arithmetic has changed very, very much at all. Once you've done that, you then have to negotiate a new relationship with Europe. And, you know, though it's said it's going to take 2 years, the going rate for doing a normal trade deal is 7 years. You know, there's a lot of discussion still to come. And that's why whoever the next Prime Minister is, I think they owe it to the country that they have got to try and reset the debate, because inevitably when you're dealing with other countries, when you're dealing with other people, even when you're dealing with people in your own political party, you're inevitably you're dealing with a series of compromises. Now, it won't surprise you to know that I voted to remain in the European Union, and I would like as close a relationship as possible. I think some of the stuff that's being talked about and returning to the 19th century is absolute fantasy. But I recognise people have spoken. I don't support a second referendum, in case any of you are thinking about asking me that one. Throughout my time in the Scottish referendum, I told people it's your one and only chance. There's no going back. You don't get a second chance. And, I think we are going to have to live with it, even though it's not my preferred outcome. So the Brexit issue and the resolution of that quite clearly is going to dominate not just this government, but the next one and the one that comes after that. The second thing I would say is this, that in the last 3 years, apart from Brexit, we've decided absolutely nothing. And, if you take an issue like long term care for the elderly, and I'm beginning to have a vested interest in that at the moment, we simply cannot put off for yet another parliament dealing with a problem where, in 20 years' time, a quarter of the population is going to be over the age of 65. So an issue like care, and not just for the elderly, but for the increasing number of people who in working age who rely on care, that's an issue that isn't going to go away. And there's similar issues confronting us in health and education and so on, and bigger issues, wider issues like climate change and so on, that we simply cannot put off because we haven't sorted out the Brexit problem. These are all issues that must command the attention of the next government, whoever the Prime Minister is. What I would say, though, in my experience of government, is basically in government, in my experience, Prime Ministers can't think of more than about 3 or 4 issues at any one time. And, if I was taking on over the Conservative Party in a couple of months' time, which I most certainly am not, I would think, what are the 2 or 3 things I might do other than Brexit, and try and deliver on them? Because otherwise, and I conclude on this point, there is a substantial risk now, and I think you can all see it, that far too many people in this country are completely losing faith in the people that they elect, the institutions and the systems we have. It's partly fueled by people who've got a vested interest in discrediting these institutions, but democracy will not work if people feel that they are not represented. There's no one out there speaking up for them. And you saw quite a bit of that in the European elections. It's not just a Conservative thing. It's a huge problem for the party I still belong to and voted for, incidentally, in case that was your second question, in the European election, which is more than can be said for most of the people I know. But, these are big, big issues. But unless people who are elected to Parliament show that they are willing to address these problems, not just Brexit, but other issues as well, then I think that sense of alienation, people becoming more and more cynical, will grow and grow. And it's easy for people to shrug their shoulders and say it doesn't matter. Well, it does, because democracy and a functioning democracy actually does matter. It partly has made this country what it is. So these are the obvious things, I think, Dean, that need to be sorted. I know they're easily sorted and talked about rather than actually sorted. But as I say, this is a chance for a reset. The final point I would make is this, which is an important one. Just at the moment, the only conversation taking place is between Tory leadership candidates and the membership. The rest of us are not really involved in it. I mean, I assume Boris Johnson's promise of a tax break for people who are elderly and people who are not paying national insurance anymore rather fits the Tory demographic. I mean, you two can tell me whether or not I'm right about that. The rest of the population matters, and I hope, before the end of July, we will hear from whoever it is that is likely to be the Prime Minister or the final 2 candidates, rather more about what they're going to do for this country rather than what they're going to do for the Conservative Party. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Well, I'm tempted to repeat what Alistair's just said, but I better think of something else to say. I mean, look, I agree with Alistair. One way or another, this Europe business is going to go on for years. There will be a whole lot of posturing about it, but in the end, we will reach a new equilibrium. We were never properly in the European Union, and I dare say we will leave it at some point. But at that point, we'll never be properly out of it, because the plain fact is that your closest trading relationships are always with the countries nearest to you. And anybody who fantasises that we can have a brave new world, trading with Australia, New Zealand, even South Korea. That's just simply not going to happen. So let's put Europe to one side. I think we're here today to talk about economic policy. So I'm going to try and concentrate on two areas. One is macroeconomic policy, and the other is microeconomic policy. Look, the first things first. This country has experienced an extraordinary supply shock through the financial crisis. We're now more than 10 years on. If you look at what output per hour is compared to the end of 2007, it has barely changed. It has increased by 0.1% a year over a 12-year period. That inevitably feeds into wages, and that explains why people across this country are pretty alienated, since nearly all of them are used to a previous world which existed from 1945 to 2008, where on the whole living standards went up year by year. Now, the one thing which is not going to sort this problem out is throwing more money on the demand side. Look, we've had QE, which accounts for something like a quarter of the national debt. We've had interest rates at around 0.5%. We've had successive governments running ridiculously high budget deficits for understandable reasons. The alternative would have been worse. But this country is not suffering from a demand side problem. And so those candidates for the Tory leadership who claim that demand side support is necessary to support the economy are living in a fantasy world. And the one thing is clear, given the supply shock we have had, is that the British economy is not going to grow rapidly anytime soon. It's a great pleasure to see my old friend, the chairman of the so-called Office for Budgetary Responsibility, sitting in the audience. And he, of all people, can tell you that trend growth is nowhere near what it was for most of the post-war period. You know, in a good year, we will grow by 1.5%. In a bad year, we will grow by 0.5%. And probably if we go over a cliff edge, which some candidates seem to be committed to doing, we will have an even bigger supply shock in the short run. So if you actually want to address Britain's economic problems, you've got to look at the supply side, and that is all about microeconomic policy. And very, very briefly, the strange thing about Britain is governments come and go, chancellors come and go, every single one. I think even, I mean, not even, particularly Alistair published a very impressive growth strategy back in 2008, 2009. And although no one will ever admit it, the contents of it look precisely the same as every other growth strategy since the Department for Economic Affairs was created back in 1964. What you need is you need proper competition. You need serious infrastructure investment. That's not about chucking £50 billion at high speed 2. It's about having a really good analytic base which enables you to see which projects will deliver the highest economic returns. Fortunately, the Treasury has that capacity now, and it can compare and contrast different schemes, and often they're really prosaic things which aren't terribly exciting. They're about building really good bypasses or an extra lane on a motorway, or most important of all, building some houses. Maybe just building an extra floor in every London house would solve the housing problem at a stroke. So infrastructure matters, innovation is important, and the university sector has a critical role to play there. You need a sensible tax system. Actually, both of the main political parties generally, until recently, have been committed to sensible tax systems. I can tell you for free, if you want to actually promote growth, probably chucking £8 billion at people earning between £60,000 and £100,000 is probably not a terribly well-targeted way of doing that, but other people have different views. The most important thing, however, of all, since we're leaving the European Union, is skills. And every government claims it's making a radical reform of the skills system. And we spend an awful lot of money on skills. but the transmission mechanism is totally hopeless. And I know I speak as a bureaucrat, you just hanker after a cross-party consensus. There are certain things which have been sorted out in this country. Unemployment comes to mind. And that's because actually the main political parties agree with how you address unemployment. It's about making work pay, active labour market measures, and a sensible minimum wage. If only we could actually have a skills system which the parties can align around, and then actually not rearrange the deck chairs continually, but actually see it through over a 20-year period, this country might yet have some hope. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Dean, thank you for the invitation to come and speak. Fascinating to hear from both a former Chancellor but also former Treasury Permanent Secretary. And Alistair, I accept the challenge that I think the party does absolutely need to speak to the country sooner rather than later, or my party does. But I think that may have to wait until the 22nd of July when the next Prime Minister is announced. What do we want from the next Prime Minister? Well, a start would be for the Conservative Party to rediscover its appetite for economic competence. And there is no doubt that rushing towards a no-deal Brexit, and I don't want to talk about Brexit very much because I think this is far broader than that, but clearly the shape of Brexit is going to impact the shape of our economy, the headroom, the space for us to develop and to take forward economic policy. But the Conservative Party needs to remember that actually when we lose our reputation for economic competence, as we did in 1992, it is a very painful way back and takes a long time to get back into government. And the consequences of losing power are going to be very severe for the country if we've also inflicted a no-deal Brexit on them in the form of a Jeremy Corbyn government. The other issue is that, and we talked about, Nick talked about rising wages. The political reality is that when the populace feel better off, more financially secure, actually the conditions for populism to flourish disappear. And that's where I think the Chancellor, whoever the next Chancellor is going to have to realise that they've got a role in helping the country to flourish and to think in a political way. We may well want to see, if we don't call it this, a return to a long-term economic plan, something that Liz and I, as new MPs in the 2010 Parliament, and many other colleagues spent a long time talking about. There were almost bonus points every time we raised it in the House of Commons. But actually that sense of the government having a plan for people's financial well-being was very important and is something that so far has been missing. I would like to see a more muscular Treasury. Not a Treasury that gets involved and becomes a spending department, as we sometimes have seen in the past, but a Treasury which works closely with Number 10, where there is a good relationship between Chancellor and Prime Minister and a feeling that actually economic policy is at the heart of the next Conservative government. The Treasury should be seen as an engine of policy. And one of the opportunities for that, an early opportunity, would be the forthcoming comprehensive spending review. Now, it's possible, given the timing of the leadership election, that actually we won't get to the comprehensive spending review that is needed and is now due because, frankly, there won't be time for a new Chancellor to put in place their programme, their priority spending, to work with government departments, although there's already a lot of work, I think, going on in the Treasury on that. So you end up with a rather sort of rollover of spending limits to the 2021 financial year. But I think that will be a great shame if that does happen, because a comprehensive spending review is a real opportunity for the government to set out its priorities for the next spending period. And having been involved in the 2015 election, I know then as Secretary of State for Education, it was very useful. It was a real tool in the department to get the department to think about the priorities for the forthcoming period. The other question I think that the next Chancellor, its government, is going to have to answer is what exactly are the fiscal rules that the government is following? There's been talk about a balanced budget by the middle of the next decade. What does that look like? We've had one of the leadership candidates talking about paying off the national debt more slowly in order to have more headroom to spend on education. Is that something that the future government will see? Do they want to have new fiscal rules which will promote a debate in Parliament about how quickly the rest of the debt that we have as a country is going to be paid off? the Treasury needs to drive departments to work together more effectively. People out in the country don't live their lives in silos. They don't want to hear that the Health Department, the Defence Department are having a battle about funding, or the Education Department and the Health Department having a battle about mental health funding in schools. They want solutions. And again, there's got to be an answer to the politics of the age where people want there to be solutions, politicians not to blame the administration, the Whitehall machinery for not getting things done. The next Chancellor is going to have to think about regional imbalances. We know that some of these imbalances drove the Brexit vote. There really hasn't been nearly enough work to address the reasons behind the 2016 referendum result. You know, really putting rocket boosters under the Northern Powerhouse, the Midlands engine, or whatever comes next, a feeling that actually people in London really do care about what's going on in the rest of the country. And I say that as an East Midlands Member of Parliament, where regional infrastructure spending is far, far lower than in other parts of the country. People talk about transport links between East and West, for example. You know, those sorts of issues really matter and resonate in people's lives. Nick talked about the tax system. I think there's actually a lot of work. I think we're beginning to see the effects of not having thought seriously about taxation policy, and the fact that particularly in relation to business taxation, the base is changing. So just in things like business rates, you know, we know that there's enormous public resentment about the fact, the perception that actually online businesses somehow have it much easier in the tax system than those that are bricks and mortar businesses. Decarbonising the economy. The government is going to announce probably shortly that it's going to commit to the net zero carbon by 2050. The Chancellor warned last week about the costs to the economy of that. The Treasury Select Committee, which I have the privilege of chairing, launched an inquiry into that last week and how that can be done. So we see economic growth whilst the economy is decarbonised. But that's going to be a real challenge for the next government and the Treasury. We've already heard talk about infrastructure spending, but infrastructure needs to be in its broadest sense. It's not just about new buildings or new bridges. You know, the rollout of 5G, the improvement of broadband, you know, those are critical parts of our infrastructure, which again make a real difference to businesses, particularly SMEs, in the way they operate, and the fact that they're able to run businesses from small and rural premises, but also to individuals. As a constituency member of Parliament, actually, the poor rollout of broadband has been quite a significant part of my post bag, and I spend an awful lot of time having to deal with Openreach at the moment. And actually that's one of the other issues, is dealing with, I think, the way the market works. I mean, we are as Conservatives supportive of the market economy, but there is a perception that there are large companies out there who are not serving the consumer. And actually the investigation, the work that people like Lord Tyree are doing at the Competition and Markets Authority, I think should be of great interest to the next government. We've already heard talk about skills and that investment, that perception that when we talk about capital and capitalism, and I've just written a chapter on this for the George Freeman 2020 Conservatives Britain Beyond Brexit book. We need to talk about people, investing in our people, making sure, and again, you know, both Liz and I are former education ministers, but not just talking about school and all about universities, but also about learning throughout life. We need to be thinking about how do we encourage employers and others to want to invest in lifelong skills as the workplace changes. The next Conservative government needs to be a constructive friend to business. The relationship with business almost broke down between 2016 and 2017. It came back a little bit after the general election. We know that at least one of our candidates in the leadership contest has an unfortunate relationship with business. You know, that's not helpful. At the moment, the Labour Party are busy reaching out to business. They're making great strides in this. The Conservative Party should be the natural friend of business, and business should feel that we're able to be on their side whilst being constructively critical. Individual financial security. I would like to see the word security much more at the heart of all future Conservative Party policies. We talk about national security, we talk about issues like defence, but actually individual financial security, going back to the desire and the need to tackle populism, people need to feel that we understand the issues that they are facing. Things like pensions, you mentioned about cross-party working together. One of the great successes has been the auto-enrolment. People actually have been saving for their retirement, people who wouldn't normally be saving. But we know that people still have, many people, particularly in poorer income, lower incomes, have very little in the way of savings or a savings buffer, and we need to be much more on their side. But people who invest in pensions are stakeholders in the future of our country. And when we talk about infrastructure, for example, what are we doing to make people realise that actually their pension funds are investing in the future of our country? And the final thing I would just say is we have a great engine of growth and business in the country, and that's our financial services industry. They have had a bit of a hearing from the Treasury in relation to Brexit and other things, but they need a much wider hearing in terms of not just about the City of London or London itself, but financial services is a huge employer, it's a huge taxpayer, and it's going to be a critical part of Britain's place in the world in the years to come. So they need to know that the whole government is on their side. Thank you very much for inviting me here today.
Well, what I want to do is inject a bit of optimism into this afternoon's proceedings, because we had new figures out today showing that unemployment again is extremely low. We've recently had figures showing that the UK is attracting more foreign direct investment than any other country in Europe, that in terms of tech unicorns, we're third only to the US and China. And I agree with Nicky, we do need a medium-term economic strategy. But I think there is huge latent potential in our country. What we need to do is have a strategy that takes us through Brexit, that makes us a more competitive, higher growth country, and also takes up the opportunities of freedoms that Brexit presents, which is the ability to have different rules and regulations, a different trajectory from the rest of Europe. And the whole term economic growth has become a bit of a unfashionable term. Again, but to me, growth isn't just a number on a spreadsheet. It represents people's opportunity. It represents the reduction of poverty. It represents the ability of people to enjoy life more, whether it's being able to buy presents for their children, be able to take the family on holiday, and where to move up in life. And I think at the heart of that is that we have to be resolutely pro-business as a government. And by that, I don't mean micromanaging business. I don't mean deciding investments in business. I don't mean business subsidies. I think there are many cases where the government can be too close to the business lobby. What I mean is more competition, opening up new markets for new entrants, and keeping taxes on business low, because we know that countries with lower debt and slightly want to disagree with what Nick was saying about we are permanently stuck in a low growth world. I don't think that's true. Now, I don't like everything that President Trump does or says, but if you look at what's happened in the US, if you look at the supply side reforms, the regulatory reforms, and the tax reforms that have taken place there, we have seen significantly higher growth in the economy and all the beneficial effects that that has resulted in. So what do I think we need to do here? Well, first of all, we need to move on from the Brexit paralysis, which I think has caused risk aversion and uncertainty in enterprise. Secondly, we need to deal with the productivity and jobs potential gap between London and other cities and other regions in Britain. And finally, we need to deal with the barriers to growth that are holding back business. So starting on Brexit, I'm probably unique in this panel in thinking that we do need to leave by the 31st of October. I don't think delaying the inevitable has benefited the UK at all. I think it's caused uncertainty, and I think it's damaged faith and trust in politics. And ultimately, we are a democracy. We are a country that respects democratic decisions. And I think we've undervalued the impact that a lack of trust can have on our future politics and our future economics. So delivering Brexit by the 31st of October is vital. Otherwise, we end up in a dangerous vacuum, which can be populated by forces that we don't want to see exist. We need a prepared exit. And the good news is, in many areas, we are prepared. We are prepared in financial services. We are prepared on borders. Of course, there are 300,000 businesses who work with the EU, who need to have the proper preparations in place. We need a campaign to achieve that. And I'm not saying that it will be easy, but I think deal or no deal, we do have to follow through. And we also just have to not look at Brexit as a damage limitation exercise. We have to look at the new opportunities that come alive from Brexit, the opportunity to have different rules and regulations. One example I would highlight is free ports, which could revive parts of our country, port cities, bring manufacturing onshore. I think those are a really exciting opportunity. But this brings me to point 2, which is that we do need to maintain our reputation for strong finances and living within our means. One of the great achievements of the last 9 years is we brought the deficit under control, and we're bringing down debt as a proportion of GDP. And I'm very proud that our country has a strong macroeconomic framework in terms of the inflation targets and the Independent Bank of England, as well as fiscal policy, which help direct government spending and tax policy. And I think at this moment of change for the UK, it would be a huge mistake to move away from that framework, to have a spending splurge, which resulted in a debt pile that we couldn't go back from. And what's going to happen as we do leave the European Union and become an independent country, our finances are going to receive even more beneficial scrutiny. And that's why I think it's vitally important that we continue to target debt falling in normal times. I think that's a strong anchor for political credibility in this country, but also our international economic credibility. I couldn't agree more with Nick, though, on the structural issues and the supply side changes that we need to see in our economy, and also the length of time that politicians have been discussing these issues. And we do need to grasp them. It is the barriers to economic growth for some business taxes. I would highlight areas like stamp duty, business rates, national insurance and income tax. We should look at all of those. I think we need to resist the desire for digital taxes. I'm very concerned that we shouldn't be in a position of robbing Peter to pay Paul. We need a fair tax system that works for everyone, but we shouldn't penalise new entrants or new ways of doing things. I'm also concerned about the level of regulatory creep we've seen and the fact that often regulations benefit big business at the expense of new entrants. One of the things I think we should consider is a moratorium on new regulations over the next 2 years as we leave the European Union, and also looking at the regulations that are being put in place at the moment. On public spending, as well as maintaining our fiscal discipline, we do need to focus on areas that will generate economic growth. Infrastructure and education have been mentioned by everybody in the panel. I agree we need to level up outside London. It's still the case that schools outside London are getting significantly less than London schools, even though we've seen London's performance increase. And I think we do know what works in education. One programme I'd highlight is phonics, which has seen our children rise from some of the worst performers in Europe in reading to some of the best performers. The problem, as anybody who's ever been involved in the education debate, is that people simply won't face the facts about what's happening, and there is a political debate. I think getting a cross-party consensus on education is probably as difficult as getting one on social care, if not more. So I do think that you can't remove the ideology from politics. You know, we are facing a Labour Party who've declared business as the enemy and they want to overthrow capitalism. I don't think reaching across the House at this juncture is particularly productive. The final area I would mention is that the UK needs to remain open to talent. I think that is incredibly important, and we need to make sure we are bringing in skilled people to work in our industries. Overall, I would say that there are no shortcuts to becoming a more successful, competitive country. We need to deliver on leaving the European Union. We cannot allow that to fester. We need to maintain our strong macroeconomic framework in terms of fiscal responsibility. And finally, we need to be absolutely serious about dealing with those structural challenges in the UK economy that have held us back for far too long.
I'm sure many questions. Can I just get a sense of... Gentleman there in the middle, by the aisle. Yeah. Name and organisation, please.
Richard Johnson from Civil Service World. A question for Lord Macpherson primarily perhaps, but I'm sure the rest of the panel will have a view. What would you advise civil servants to do in this period to prepare for the new Prime Minister? There's established rules of what civil servants can do during an election period, but how should the Treasury be dealing with the proposals that are coming from leadership candidates?
Nick.
Well, I think very simply the civil service needs to be prepared. It needs to listen to some of the options which are currently being considered, approach them with a totally open mind and be ready to advise whomsoever is the Chancellor in the coming period. Inevitably, there are a whole lot of processes which are either underway or due to come to a head in the autumn. I mean, there'll be a whole lot of issues about how you sequence those, from appointing the next governor of the Bank of England through to the next spending review. But I mean, look, this is what the civil service is there for. None of the ideas, I mean, I know politics is all about difference, but actually, when it comes to things like tax options, these things have been under consideration for years and years and years. So the critical thing is to be able to present to the new government very quickly what the trade-offs are, what the baseline is. There'll be another OBR forecast, a fiscal sustainability report. This is the decade when the demographic pressures really start hitting us. So it's, I mean, for the civil service, this is quite frankly business as usual.
Gentleman there in the middle, by the name and organisation, please.
Tony Halmos from King's College London. Could I ask the panel whether, in the light of the Chief Secretary's phrase about fiscal responsibility, which is current government policy, whether that means that the current Chancellor should call out all those candidates in the Tory leadership election who are, let's just say, not sounding fiscally responsible with their fancy tax plans with no indication whatsoever of how they're going to be paid for. And in the case of the Chief Secretary on that question, it may be rather than should they, is maybe will, or should he do that as Chancellor? A question of where, will he do that as Chancellor?
Who wants to go first? Nicky.
Well, I'm sure that Philip will have his say, and he's bound to be doing interviews or making speeches in the course of the leadership contest. I think in a way to the first question as well. I mean, of course, we're going to know by next Thursday who our two final candidates are. So I'm not sure I'd rush towards commenting on everything in the course of the next 10 days but there will be a period, obviously, when people will have to come up. There'll be enormous amounts of media scrutiny as well, quite rightly, and I'm sure that think tanks and others will have their say. But of course, the more, and the reason that we need to have a contest that goes all the way till the 22nd of July is to make sure that the scrutiny has happened, and so the maddest ideas perhaps don't make it to actually asking for official civil service advice.
Liz.
Well, Philip has already made public comment about fiscal responsibility, as have I. I was asked this question at the Lords Economic Affairs Committee last week, and I suggested that maybe the IFS might be better placed as a more neutral observer rather than any politician in the Conservative Party. And I don't think Paul Johnson's here, but I do think it would be useful if the IFS, and they have been sort of costing various plans ad hoc, but certainly in the final stage, I would like to see that about the final two candidates.
Well, it'd be interesting to see how this calling out works if the author of one of these ridiculous proposals actually becomes Prime Minister, because he can hardly say it was a great idea 4 weeks ago, but it's not now, though knowing that individual who knows he might well say that. I would think, Nick is right, the civil service will always prepare for whatever eventuality there is. There's just one thing I was going to say that it flows a bit from what both Liz and Nicky were saying, and that is that I do think it is time to revisit the debate about what the state, the government ought to be doing and what the private sector ought to be doing. Because it's really for the last 30 years there was a political consensus which is breaking up on both sides now, actually. But I was just reflecting as I came down from the train in Edinburgh today, you won't find many people who'd die in the ditch to defend rail franchising now. Maybe it's run its course. Equally, I heard in the news today there's a thing that EDF were going to proposing charging £6 extra per customer per year to fund the building of a nuclear power station in Sizewell. This is one coming after one they've not yet finished or have got very far with yet in Hinkley Point. I do think actually if you want nuclear in this country, and there's an argument about it, it would probably be cheaper for the state to do it rather than let the private sector do it at an artificially fixed and inflated price. And equally, Nicky mentioned about the railways, and I'd come back to something that, and I know it was our government that suggested it, but I had high hopes that you lot would have killed it off in 2010. HS2, if you really want to help the northern and Midlands part of England, why on earth are you building a railway that for the first 10 years only benefits London commuters? Why don't you perhaps think about it from the other way around? And I think you said something about this, and who knows what might happen. But this is a massive infrastructure project, and it's starting at the wrong end of the country when we know there is a need, if you want to tackle some of the, not just the economic problems of the north and the Midlands of England, as well as the political problems, that would be not a bad place to start. So that's another area where, perhaps there's a vain hope, some fresh thinking to see what's suitable for us in this century rather than halfway through the last century might be a good idea.
Sorry, Liz, you want to come back and then...
I wanted to come back on this idea that the current state of our railways suggests that they should be nationalised. I would go in the opposite direction and say a country like Japan, which has ownership of both the train and the tracks in the private sector, that's properly regulated, actually delivers a lower public subsidy, a better service, and also you see development along the line taking place. So I think the problem we've got at the moment is it's a halfway house. So I wouldn't agree that that's an issue about the state. I think it's an issue about...
I'm not arguing for nationalisation because I'm old enough to remember British Rail. In fact, my sandwich I had at lunchtime, I think it's probably a relic from those happy days. I just think what the system at the moment where it allows people to bid and make wildly optimistic promises.
I think the system needs to be reformed.
Yes, yeah. which it does. And also the Japanese system is actually quite heavily regulated as to what they do. I think it does need to be changed. And also the pattern for what you need in long-distance national rail as opposed to regional rail around Manchester and around London is quite different. So it's a change, but it's just it's away from this idea that one state is bad, private is good, is just as nonsense as people who argue the other way around.
The other point, just on the zero-based capital review, which we are conducting at the Treasury, that will conclude in the spending review. But the final decision on HS2 comes in December. And it's certainly the case that we are not investing enough in our intra-city rail network. So Leeds is the largest city in Europe without its own metro system. There's a recent study that shows that Birmingham could be 33% more productive. It had better cross-city transport. And it has to be part of the solution, along with allowing cities like London to grow and housing to become more affordable. We need to improve the infrastructure in other cities so they are more productive and competitive.
Right, I'm not going to talk about the railways because that would be very bad. So look, I hope Liz is right. I hope that we are entering a brave new world where the economy grows by 3% a year. But all my experience of governments are that they get into difficulty when they assume that the future is going to be better than the past. Actually, you should kind of assume, at least for the medium term, as I know Robert Choke will be, that productive capacity will grow broadly as it has done in the last 5 years, because there's no other evidence. So taking that view, understanding the demographic pressures which have finally arrived, and looking at the unsustainability of the tax system. We have a whole lot of taxes, and some of them have come up today, like the business rates, council tax, fuel duty, all of which are unsustainable. We have an absurd stamp duty system which discourages mobility of any sort. I think, I mean, revenues have held up really well recently, but I suspect it's going to get more difficult from here on in. So I think it's going to be incumbent on whoever forms the next government to have really coherent policies on the public finances And fortunately, given that we have an independent Office for Budgetary Responsibility, actually, if their policies are incoherent, Mr. Choate and others will be pointing that out to the Treasury Committee on a regular basis.
We look forward to hearing the evidence.
So many questions, if I can take them as braces of questions. Lady in the middle in the aisle there. First question. Name and organisation, please.
Thank you, Carol Walker. I was interested that Liz was saying that parts of the economy are actually already quite well prepared for a no-deal Brexit. Do you think that those leadership candidates who are openly contemplating that as an option should immediately ramp up the no-deal preparations? And I would just be interested to know whether others on the panel share Liz's optimism about a lot of key sectors already being pretty well prepared for others to get on board.
One more question. Gentleman there in the middle there. Yeah. Name and organisation, please.
Sure. George Crozier from the Chartered Institute of Taxation. Assuming that the panel don't think that we've abolished the economic cycle, what should we be doing now to prepare for the next recession?
Nick, do you want to go first?
Well, look, we should be fixing the roof while the sun's shining. We should be running surpluses. We should be reducing the national debt. This is not a time to go on some massive spending spree.
Alistair.
Well, I take your point about the need to reduce our debt and so on, but we can't at the same time then talk about the need to look at some of the infrastructure. I mean, housing is a case in point where time and time again successive governments have said we would like the private sector to do that, and it hasn't delivered in an awful lot of parts of the country. Housing shortages is not just a London problem. It's a problem throughout the whole country. And I think government does have a role there, and I'm not talking about the railways anymore, but I make my point. In relation to Carol's point, I think the financial services industry is reconciled to it rather than prepared for it as in, isn't this great? Because the problem is they really don't know what world they're going into. There's been a hell of a lot of debate about customs unions and about tariff barriers, but a lot of what conditions the financial services industry ability to operate are mutual recognition of rules, for example. So I think to characterize it as an enthusiasm embrace of Brexit, is not actually right. I think that they're used to trading across the world and across barriers, but the big thing that they don't like, and I suspect a lot of certain bigger businesses don't like, is the uncertainty. When you say, we actually do not know, and this is the point I made earlier, even if you get your leaving deal by October, which is doable, but presumably it needs a lot of people in the House of Commons, not just on my former colleagues, but your European research group to say, look, there's going to be compromise here. It also means in the next 2 to 5 years it takes you to negotiate what our relationship with the biggest single market in the world is. There's going to be a lot of uncertainty, and anyone will tell you uncertainty does have a tendency to make people put off making decisions. So reconciled to leaving, but embracing it. Of course you'll always find a few are willing to do that, but I think it would be wrong to characterize that as a sort of general view of the financial services industry.
Liz.
So on Carol's question, in terms of government preparation, all the primary legislation that needs to pass for no deal has been done, and there is a number of bits of secondary legislation needs to be passed. I think the challenge we face is business readiness. I mentioned the 300,000 businesses who work with the EU, making sure those businesses are prepared. And I'm not in any way saying this will be easy, but in terms of readiness, we are considerably more ready than we were earlier this year, and the government continues with those no-deal preparations. And I think it would be a massive mistake to take no deal off the table. I think I would rather we secured a deal, but ultimately, I think there has already been a big cost of delay to the UK economy, and there is also a massive question of trust in UK politics as well. So I'm not saying that that is the ideal option, but we are ready as a government to deal with that, and the challenge will be making sure that the private sector is, and that particular sectors that are affected get the necessary help and support. In answer to the question about being ready for a recession, I think the key thing is making sure we get our debt down as a proportion of GDP. We went into the financial crisis with a much lower level of debt. That was the deficit ballooned. I think there were some public, forgive me, Alistair, some excess public spending in the 2000s. But we are now paying that down as a proportion of GDP. I think we need to continue to focus on, because that is what provides our economy with resilience. Housing, to me, we're already spending £34 billion as a government on housing, as a combination of housing benefit and the money that we spend through MHCLG. And a lot of this is dealing with the fact that we have an appalling planning system that is not allowing enough houses to be built. So Germany has built twice as many houses as we have over the last, I think, 40 years. Prices in Tokyo are much cheaper since they liberalised their planning system. We need to allow cities to build up. We need to allow changes to take place, because not only...
I'd like to see you succeed in that.
Yeah,
Thank you. I'll take that as a supportive voice on that front. But we do, because it's an invisible tax on everybody. Not just the young people who can no longer afford to live where a lot of good jobs are, and it's not just London, it's York, it's Oxford, it's Cambridge, but also all of us who are paying through our taxes to pay housing benefit for houses that are more expensive than they should be because of the shortage of supply. I think this is one of the big challenges of our age.
So to answer the first question about no deal preparations, I think I was going to say, echo what Liz said. It's not just enough for the government to be prepared. It's about businesses, but individuals as well. And of course, we know there are a number of individuals who are either EU citizens themselves, or married to, or employing EU citizens, for whom the rules are still, some of the rules still to be confirmed, and that's extremely unsettling for those individuals. In terms of businesses, I think it's worth just looking at the Bank of England agents survey and the preparedness of individual businesses. Obviously, a number are prepared for the 29th of March, and we know the impact of stockpiling and then the unwinding of that. We've also seen, obviously, what happened in relation to the car industry, who decided, obviously, to change their working patterns in April, and the knock-on effect that's had on the economy. Whether they will prepare in the same way for the 31st of October, whether they can prepare in the same way for the 31st of October, remains to be seen. And I'm sorry that we're putting people in this country through that. In terms of the economic cycle, the honest truth is that nobody ever knows where the next crisis is going to come from. We had a financial crisis, obviously, last time. It's always got a slightly different complexity, whether it's something that starts here, whether it's something that starts abroad, and an economy that we are very much related to or affected by. Nick's right, which is to make sure that we are the economy is as strong and we are prepared as possible. We've had a great record on the deficit, but the debt is still, in terms of proportion of GDP, is still high. Again, we've heard about the impact of the demographics as well. Just in relation to housing, we have been talking about this a long time. One of the debates to be had is, are we building the right kind of housing? And again, I don't need many more executive 5-bedroom houses in the Midlands or in my constituency. What I need is housing suitable for people on, obviously, lower incomes, but also people who are obviously older in terms of housing that's going to suit them as they get older, to help them to remain independent for as long as possible, while the government actually sorts out, and I think it has to be done on a cross-party basis, as much as possible, the social care system for the next few decades.
I see quite a lot more questions. I'm just trying to get a flavour of this gentleman there. We'll take them again as a brace in the front row. Yeah, there. Name and organisation, please.
Ned Simons from Huffington Post. A couple, if I may. Liz Truss, do you think the priority for the next Conservative Prime Minister should be cutting taxes for the wealthy? And Alistair Darling, you mentioned Brexit. What do you think the electoral impact for Labour will be if Jeremy Corbyn does succumb to pressure and backs a second referendum, more explicitly?
Gentleman behind you as well. Second. Name and organisation, please.
Sure, Henry Kerr from The Economist magazine. I have a question for Liz Truss, which is that I was interested by your praise for President Trump's economic model, which seems to be an increasing theme among some people in the Conservative Party. But I was wondering how you square that with your fiscal hawkishness, given that the signature move President Trump's made to run $1 trillion deficit, massive deficit finance, tax cut, and you'd struggle to find an economist outside the White House who claimed, as you did, that the boost that's been seen in America to growth is supply side rather than just a sugar rush from that deficit?
Okay.
Liz.
Shall I answer those questions? So, starting with tax. When the higher rate, 40 pence rate, was first introduced in 1988, 5% of people were paying that tax. It's now 15% of people, and senior teachers, middle managers are being dragged into higher rate tax that weren't before. Now, this government has got a tremendous record in terms of raising the personal allowance. We've cut taxes for those on basic rate by £1,200. And I think it is right that we address the unfairness of a higher rate that was meant to be for the absolute top earners, hitting people who are senior teachers, senior nurses in the public sector, as well as in the private sector. I think it's the right policy. Now, in my speech, I commented on a number of other areas of potential tax reform: stamp duty, business rates, national insurance. But obviously, I also want to make sure that we stick within our fiscal rule of keeping debt falling as a proportion of GDP. On the President Trump, I did say that I don't support everything President Trump does or says. But I think his agenda on regulatory issues has been impressive in many areas. In fact, I went over to the US and met President Trump's head of regulatory, and they told me they'd actually followed some of the things we'd be doing in Britain in terms of our one-in, two-out policy on regulation, which was led by Oliver Letwin during the Red Tape Challenge. Now, that stopped in 2016, and what I'm suggesting is we should reintroduce that approach, because it's quite easy for bits of government to say, we need to do this, we need to do that, we need to do the other. The problem is quite often it can fall on particularly small businesses, lots of demands for extra paperwork. I think that is a problem in our economy. So what I would like to see is a simplified approach to regulation, a continuation on cracking down on regulation, particularly that is harming the ability of smaller businesses to grow. So I think we can learn from some of the, and economists I've spoken to say some of the growth is the effect of a fiscal stimulus, and as I've said, I don't support breaking our fiscal rules, but some of the growth is the effect of regulatory reform. And particularly what people have said to me is it's the effect of not worrying that new regulation is about to be lumped on you. Because there was a concern under President Obama that there was just a massive pipeline of further regulation on business.
The same point. Just one point in America. The American economy has been growing since the end of 2009, largely as a result of the fiscal stimulus that Obama put in. And it just so happens that the government on this side of the Atlantic did the same thing at the same time, and our economy started to grow in 2010. I thought I'd just remind you two of that.
You can read it all in Back from the Brink.
Yes, that's a very good point. Still on sale from all good booksellers and so on. I think on the point directly to me, I think what really hit Labour in the European elections is not having a clarity on its position on the second referendum. In politics, if you're not clear about something big, you will get taken to the cleaners, and that's precisely what happened. I think there are several problems. Although, if I was the leader of the Labour Party, I'd bear in mind that predominantly the membership and the people who vote for Labour remain. They're not leavers. And if you basically say to your core support, a large chunk of your support, well, I'm not really with you, it's not surprising they take their business elsewhere. And also, it's never been clear to me that Jeremy Corbyn isn't a Brexiteer, because if you look at his track record since 1974, and I think what he wants to see is a Tory Brexit. So therefore, I'm sure they would say nothing will go wrong, but if things go wrong, it'll be their fault, not anybody else's. But unless you have clarity on your position, then it's not surprising that people will go elsewhere. Now, I've told you what I think about a second referendum, because my Scottish experience tells me the scars and the divisions mean that if you have another one, it won't be a cold examination of the facts. It'll be about betrayal, it'll be a lack of trust. You can just imagine how the whole thing will be fought. Now, it may come to it at the end of the day, especially if it takes 7 or 8 years before we get some sort of final deal and everybody will forget about these things. Don't smile, it could happen. You know, it could happen, but all I'd say in relation to this is you do not have clarity as to where you stand on big issues. You can't be surprised if people vote for somebody else.
Should it be clear clarity to be against one?
Well, my personal, I'm not persuaded that we should be having one, but all I'm telling you is that the vast majority of the Labour Party, the majority of his MPs, and my guess is a large chunk, though not all, of Labour voters say that they want another vote, either a confirmatory one at the end of the day, if not rerun just now. It's not universal. And I live in one of the most remaining cities in the UK, and an awful lot of people who I know voted Remain do not want another referendum, so that may be partially influenced by the divisions that are still running in Scotland from the one we had in 2014.
Nicky, final.
Thank you. I just wanted to come back on this issue about obviously tax policy and proposals in the leadership campaign. I mean, Liz is right, of course, about regulatory reform. Far too much stopped happening in government in 2016 because of Brexit. And one of the great challenges for the next Prime Minister, the next Chancellor, the next Cabinet is going to be making sure that we can do more than one thing at a time. I think we have to be really careful as a party, and this is actually the core of the leadership campaign we should be seeing, the debate we should be having. Are we going to restore our fortunes as a party by appealing to Brexit Party supporters and heading off in that direction? I firmly believe that is the wrong choice for my party to make, that actually we'd be much stronger and we'd stand a much better chance of winning a majority in a future election if we are appealing to the centre ground of British politics. That's why I'm co-chairing the One Nation group of Conservatives. We launched our Declaration of Values, talks about a commitment to public spending, talks about a commitment to competition but breaking up monopolies as well. And I think we have to be really careful about the tone of announcements. Not just the details. I mean, actually, the tax break for higher earners paid for partly by increasing those same higher earners' national insurance contributions. So the people who benefit actually are the pensioners who are not paying national insurance contributions. I don't think that's entirely straight with people who won't get as much back in their pay packet as they might think. But the tone of those things, the message it sends out to our centre ground potential voters is really, really important to think about. It's the same as the desire to keep cutting corporation tax. Actually, it's not corporation tax that is going to encourage our small and medium-sized enterprises, but things like business rates, things like breaks, national insurance breaks for employing your first or second employee. That is what makes the difference between whether you fail or you succeed as a small business. And we say we're the party of enterprise.
Thank you.
I just wanted to come back on that point. I mean, the logic is that you need to raise the national insurance threshold at the same time as you raise the rate. Otherwise, you create increased complexity within the tax system. And that has been the problem of our tax system. And I think the best, forgive me, Alistair, the best budget of all time was Nigel Lawson's 1988 budget, which simplified the tax system. That's the reason for that. That's the reason. But can I come back? I just want to get a slight opportunity to talk, because other candidates in this leadership election have proposed ripping up the VAT system. Now, that would be hugely disruptive to business at a time when we're leaving the European Union.
But because we're leaving, we can do it. We could change it. Making tax digital is a nightmare.
Can you imagine? I mean, we've just talked about how the regulatory burden on business is too high, and we've not done enough about that for the past 3 years. To rip up the VAT system and replace it with a as yet unspecified sales tax, I think would be very worrying to businesses across the country.
Final two questions. Just take them as a gentleman there and gentleman at the back. Yep, in the middle. Yep. If you wait till the name and organisation.
John Burt, House of Lords. I'm sure we all would sign up to Nick's wish list of what good government is about. Can I press the panel on one issue, however, which has come up a number of times, namely investment in national infrastructure? For 50 years, if you look at transport infrastructure, we've invested less than any G7 country. The result is we have by far the worst transport infrastructure in of any of the G7 countries, indeed in the developed world. We know, and it last happened, I think, on your watch, Alistair and Nick, in 2009, when you look back over 40 years, every time we have a national economic problem, the Treasury, and it is the Treasury, and it's often the civil servants in the Treasury, immediately cut capital spending, and it's happened over and over again in successive governments. Is that good? I'm currently involved in a business in the north of England, and the transport systems in the north of England are absolutely terrible. I am in favour of HS2, but that's only one piece of infrastructure. We need a complete revamp. We're 50 years behind. Is it going to change?
One final question at the back. Name and organisation, please.
Thank you very much. It's a slightly different question.
Name and organisation, please.
Oh, sorry, Sean O'Grady from The Independent. Good afternoon. One slightly different question about the value-added tax, which is that leaving aside the hassle, is there an economic advantage to replacing it with the so-called simpler sales tax?
Alphabetical order, Alistair.
Well, on that latter point, not that I've seen, and of all the problems that face this country at the moment, that I don't think is one of them. And also, I'd be wary about if anyone came up to me and said, I'll replace VAT with a much simpler system. We'll see how long it was simple for by the time you've got all the anti-avoidance and, the stuff that makes VAT such a, sometimes a difficult thing to negotiate. On John's point, yes, you're right that the thing that matters, and particularly in transport and railways, is to have consistent investment. Now, we attempted to do that, giving Network Rail a 10-year budget to do that. More people are using the railways now than at any time since in post-war years. Where I also agree with you, though my solution is not obviously the same as yours, is that once you go off the main lines, and if you look at the east-west links, railway links, they're rubbish. But that's why my point of, if you've got £56 billion to spend on HS2, the first 10 years, the benefit of that goes to London commuters, south of Birmingham. It doesn't actually hit the Midlands, and let alone the north of England, until the 30s. And I don't know if it ever gets to the part of the world in which I live. But I think I'm glad Liz says it's coming up for review in December. I would argue for spending the same amount of money, but perhaps dealing with the more pressing northern problems rather than the ones in the south at the moment.
Nick.
Well, first, a much simpler form of VAT, sales tax. I mean, look, we had something called purchase tax. It was hopeless. It was inefficient. It resulted in lots of double taxation. There is a certain reason why, clues in the name, VAT tax is value added. Okay, it's complicated, but actually, in terms of intellectual coherence, it's a far better tax, and it's no coincidence that most countries across the world have ended up with something similar. So that, I mean, look, I can just tell you that's not going to happen. We will continue with that, I can predict. John raises actually a really interesting issue. I mean, infrastructure investment fell off a cliff when we went to the IMF in 1976. I agree with you that up until 1999, when we started separating out the capital from the revenue budget, the Treasury's inclination was to cut investment because it's easy and no one notices it. So I agree with Alice's earlier point. I mean, look, when I say we need to broadly balance the budget, I was thinking very much of the current side of the equation. I would be quite prepared to borrow to invest, but it has to be really serious investment. It has to be coherent. I think the country can afford to borrow to invest, provided there's a proper economic return from that investment. And I would prioritize transport. I think it's important. I worry about the amount of resource which HS2 takes up. But the flip side of investing more is that this country, the voters and the politicians they elect have got to get off this addiction to consumption. This country is obsessed with consuming. It has huge debts, both in the private sector and the public sector, and that's because everybody always wants to buy things on a never never and put it on future generations to pick up the bill. Well, the next generation's had enough. It's already getting lower pensions. It's having to pay for our pensions. And I'm worried about leaving it with a big debt bill on top. So if we're going to invest more, we've really got to look at things like the so-called triple lock. and I'm glad to see the BBC at least is prepared to take tough decisions, even when the politicians have basically wriggled out of taking that decision on free TV licenses. But we will only get somewhere on this. And this is, I just want to end up with this point. If politicians are prepared to have an honest conversation, whether it's about Brexit, whether it's about the public finances, and one of the really depressing things since, certainly since I left government, when everything was fine in March 2016, you know, we used to have really quite serious prime ministers and chancellors, and I very much hope that we will return to that.
Nicky.
Well, there's an invitation, isn't it? So we'll wait to see who obviously gets those positions. Just in relation to national infrastructure, I don't think anyone would disagree about regional transport. The honest truth is we need to do both regional, and I'm also a supporter of HS2. I mean, I think we need to think about different ways. We obviously are waiting for the successor to PFI, if there is such a thing. In my train network, the Midland Main Line, actually we were told we were going to get it electrified, then it was cancelled. Actually, there is appetite amongst the private sector to do that investment. Has anybody actually talked to them, investigated it, worked out whether it would pay? I mentioned earlier on about one of the great success stories is about auto-enrolment. There's an awful lot of money sitting out there in pension funds where actually people might feel they've got a stake in the country, even if housing sometimes proves elusive. Actually, a pension fund which is investing in the country, in our infrastructure, is very important. But I go back to what I said, we talk a lot about transport. I think things like the National Infrastructure Authority need to be massively beefed up, given more independence, more of a say and everything else. But let's not forget digital infrastructure as well, which I think is going to be phenomenally important to the future of this country. And just in relation to VAT, well, why not ask the question? I mean, as I said in my remarks, you know, the tax base is changing. VAT was introduced in the 1970s. It is one of the taxes that as we leave the EU, I mean, I'm not somebody who wanted that to happen in the first place. We're going to go, then there are certain things that we'll be able to ask. And actually there is quite an interesting proposal by, dare I say it, Dean, a rival think tank that published recently about having, certainly for smaller businesses, a single consolidated tax, which would be in relation to VAT and employment taxes and potentially corporation tax as well. There's a £12.6 billion tax gap in relation to VAT, £3.5 billion lost through errors in the accounting system. It is so complex that there are court cases about whether a Jaffa cake is a cake or a biscuit. This cannot be a system which we think is going to be sustainable and right for the 21st century. Let's ask the question if you want to have the honest debate.
Liz.
Well, I speak to a lot of businesses, and VAT is not something that they register as their top concern. I think business rates, stamp duty, the levels of income tax, national insurance are all a bigger priority. And I particularly think it's the burden on business of introducing a new system that would be massive just at this juncture when we need to make life as easy as possible for businesses who want to start up and grow. I agree with pretty much all the comments on infrastructure. We are spending at the moment, I think it's called a sustained 40-year high on infrastructure, so we are putting the money in. I do think we need to leverage more from the private sector into infrastructure investment, and I also think we need to give more power to local areas, including considering things like tax devolution, local raising of bonds, because at the moment it is too centralised, the decision making, and it's not allowing local areas to improve their infrastructure. And you know, I worry particularly about fibre, that Spain already has 70% of its countries fibred up. I think we're at 6%. Our current plan is 2032, which I think is far too slow. And we all know on the current trajectory which places will get that last. It will be rural areas and it'll be small towns. And actually, those places are the places that can benefit most with more remote working, more ability to set up new startup businesses. So I think we need to look at reversing that and looking at digital infrastructure in some of those places early on.
Thank you. Well, just want to say before concluding proceedings tonight that this is the first in a series of events what we want from the next Prime Minister. We're doing our next one on housing on Thursday afternoon. Day after tomorrow, next week, we'll be having on the 18th slightly different theme of can the Conservatives win in Canterbury and Middlesbrough at the same time, with Sir Linton Crosby, with Amber Rudd, with Andrew Feldman and with Ben Houchin, the Mayor of Middlesbrough, to which of course you'll all be very welcome. It's a privilege to have had opened with this panel tonight. I think the pressures which I've placed on all of them, threatening presence at hustings, anniversaries and so on, has been probably stretched things to the breaking point, but they've been absolutely brilliant, and I just want to thank, on behalf of all of you, for an outstanding performance from all of them, and all of them from coming near and far. Thank you all. Thank you.